Hi, Shay. I'm so glad to have you here today.
Oh, Meg, thank you so much.
Well, it is great to be talking with you. And I love that we're talking about leaky brain today because it's so important. And everyone's talking about leaky gut, which is also so important, but we're not really talking about how it's crossing the blood-brain barrier. And it also affects your brain and your mood and all of those things. So I'm excited to dive in. But before we get started, could you just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got to where you are today?
Yes, for sure. I'm super excited to talk about this topic too. It's just definitely one of my most just favorite topics, something I'm so passionate about and I see in so many of my clients. So I'll be excited to dive into that. And I think the biggest reason I'm so passionate about it is because I had it. So, I wanted to, be a doctor or pursue medicine from a very young age since I was really little, like 3 or 4 years old. I was like, I'm going to be a doctor. And I really started having health issues around the age of 14, 15 years old. And, it started with anxiety and acne and really bad gut issues and terrible periods. That's kind of where I started. And back then, just like many of my clients, it was antibiotics and birth control pills. And unfortunately, it made it worse. I also grew up in the, early mid 90s. And that was at the height of a lot of crappy food and processed foods and tons of glyphosate. And I had a horrible nutrition. I was definitely the Eggo waffle eater with the Jones soda and the, mac and cheese microwaved in plastic that you still, ate as it melted in the plastic. It was terrible. So I had all those health issues and I started developing seizures around that time as well, only on my menstrual cycle. So really interesting. And not always on my, not always, not every month. So there was a lot of things going on. So we started seeing a lot of people, countless and countless specialists from all over the country, tons of neurologists. I was put on tons of medications and it never helped. I mean, I just got worse and worse and worse. And I really, unfortunately, dealt with that for about 10 years. Went to college, made it through college, still felt terrible every day and had acne and all of those things. Decided, of course, to get on more birth control pills and antibiotics to just try to build up my self-esteem, to be honest, because at that point you're just really struggling. And so got back on those for my wedding and I literally think I felt worse on my wedding than any other day in my life. Like I physically felt so terrible. I didn't even eat. Like I couldn't eat. I had pill-induced esophagitis from the doxycycline I was on. Like it was a nightmare. And so I was unwell for a very long time. And during college, I decided I wanted to become a PA. So I graduated undergrad and literally 2 weeks later, I started PA school at Texas Tech. And so I started that all in the midst of feeling terrible. Again, made it through PA school with horrible nutrition, terrible stress, on medications that were not helping, still dealing with seizures. I mean, really not a good place. And graduated PA school, took my first job, and again, was at my sickest. I remember crying after work, just being basically like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I can't help people because I can't help myself. I barely am getting through the day. And I just feel so terrible all the time. And so I quit that job to try to find a little bit of a slower paced job. And so I found psychiatry. So I started working in conventional psychiatry, and that is where everything changed for me. I worked and was blessed to work for an amazing provider who used some integrative practices in our office. And so I was first introduced to this idea of using supplements and genetic testing. And like, that was my first exposure to that. We weren't taught those things in school. I was actually definitely the person who was very much like, that's all woo woo, like, whatever. So started working in psychiatry, and it was still a very conventional setting, but we used supplements like magnesium, and we tested things like MTHFR, and we used activated folate and all of these things. Now, did we talk about nutrition and lifestyle and gut health? No, but we were learning, at that state, and it was really awesome. So I got testing done, and I started kind of like digging into this a little bit. And while I was working there, I I was still doing terrible. And I met a functional medicine pharmacist for the first time. And no joke, I saw her, and it was the first time I ever felt seen or heard or hope ever in my whole life. And she did a few things very quickly, and I felt basically 90% improvement within 2 weeks of working with her after literally a decade of seeing tons of specialists. And we changed nutrition. She told me I couldn't do HIIT workouts 7 times a week right now. She told me, you know, I had to work on lifestyle stuff, and we did some bioidentical hormones back then because all my hormones were shut off because of stress and all of these things. So that's where my journey started. And I started researching the heck out of it because I was like, what is happening? Like, I feel like a different person. And so it was pretty obvious. She was the one who told me, like, what are you doing? You need to do this. And I was like, yeah, there's nothing else that I'd rather do. Like, I cannot not do this. I mean, it changed my life, and everyone needs to know about this. So I went back to functional medicine school while I was still working in psychiatry, started trying to implement some of it with my patients, and they were like, why are you asking me about my gut health all of a sudden, you know? But, and I realized that it wasn't aligned anymore, that I really wanted to completely switch. And so within about 6 months, I left conventional medicine and I started Shea Leonard Wellness Health Consulting. And it was the best decision I've ever made. And I haven't looked back since. So that's kind of what brings me to today, and my health and everything has been obviously, just like everyone, ebbs and flows, but I mean, 110 times better than I could have ever imagined naturally. And then being able to work with women who have been, you know, unheard and unseen for so many years, to find hope and help again is really exciting. So yeah, that's
Yeah, it is. It's so powerful. And I think most of us, it's so interesting because most of us in this space have these health journeys where you feel like, okay, you know, a lot of us came from that conventional side of medicine where the drug, you know, we work trained that drugs, we knew the protocols, we knew why. And then when you see like, oh, I was in the conventional medical space and I wasn't getting answers and I still felt like this. And now I feel amazing and I have the energy I deserve, the calmness and the peace. And it's just so uplifting. And the magic happens. I think what you said is when you don't want to go back. I always tell the people I'm working with, I'm like, you get to the point where you're not doing this because I said you should, or because someone else said you should. You're doing it because you know it makes you feel better. And it's really so powerful to do.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so let's dive into leaky brain. So, you know, like we said, we were talking a lot about leaky gut. A lot of us understand the intestinal permeability, how things can get through the gut barrier, but we also have leaky brain. So things can also actually cross. We have a blood-brain barrier too, where things cross the blood-brain barrier, affect things like anxiety, depression, mood disorders. So can we dive a little bit into exactly kind of the dynamics behind leaky brain?
Yeah, absolutely. So leaky brain, kind of in a nutshell, number one is just as common as leaky gut, but it is more complex. So it's a little more challenging to address versus something like leaky gut. But they are similar. So we have our blood-brain barrier, and it's mostly, you know, composed of astrocytes, these glial cells, and most of our brain, 90% of our brain is made up of glial cells, not neurons. So we're learning about all of these kind of different dynamics there. So when we say leaky brain, you know, our blood-brain barrier is semi-permeable, just like our gut lining. And so when it gets degraded and inflamed, we can get things like endotoxins and lipopolysaccharides and enzymes and autoimmune antibodies, and all of these things can start going into our brain. And we get neuroinflammation, we get brain inflammation. And brain inflammation is interesting because there's like mild, moderate, and severe. Basically, there's transient neuroinflammation, which is where people are like, you know, like sometimes I get like fatigue or brain fog, you know, or maybe I eat something and it makes me feel kind of out of it, and you know, it's kind of transient. And then we have people with chronic inflammation, chronic brain inflammation, and I can relate to this. The number one symptom is brain fog. So a lot of people are unsure what that means. And someone who personally experienced it, was probably one of my most debilitating symptoms, I would say. it literally feels like you're in a fog. It's hard to describe. You feel very out of it, almost dissociated. You're not really present. You can't really think. Your neurons are basically slowed down. So we're not having good connections there. So it literally causes foggy thinking and feeling. In people with chronic neuroinflammation, that's their life most days. It can be extremely debilitating. And we see things like, I just can't get out of bed. I don't have any motivation. I have a lot of depression. And it's happening often. And there's days, few and far between, where you wake up and you know you don't have it that day. And you can tell, like, oh my gosh, like I feel clear-headed today. And then the next day you're just praying and hoping that you wake up and you feel clear-headed again. And then depending on what's happened and if it got triggered again, it's kind of this endless cycle. So that's like chronic neuroinflammation. And then last one is true priming, is what it's called, glial cell priming. And that's definitely a whole different dynamic. That's a pretty severe dynamic. It happens from things like traumatic brain injuries and stuff. And those individuals are extremely sensitive. They can get full blown like sickness syndrome, where if they don't get, exactly 8 hours of sleep, it's like they cannot function at all. And that's just a really big part of their life. And so, as you can imagine, this is extremely debilitating for people. So, for like transient inflammation, to be honest, simple nutritional changes can completely fix it. I mean, people notice this significant. If brain fog's gone, we work on healing the gut lining and we heal the gut and, repair some nutrients. And someone with transient inflammation, I mean, it can resolve within weeks, very quickly. In chronic inflammation, it can definitely take a little bit longer, but it's similar. We can really do a lot with nutrition and stress reduction, herbs and things like that. And then glial cells a little different, and it's harder to kind of know if that's what it is unless you have this like history of traumatic brain injury or autism or something. We can see some glial priming there, and that's a little bit of a different dynamic. But yeah, it's super common. Leaky brain is very common, and the biggest symptom is brain fog.
Right. And you mentioned before the genetic testing. So some of them, like the MTHFR, and there's some common genetic things, that some variants that we see when we're talking about these dynamics. Do you want to dive a little bit into that?
Yeah. So, a lot of people nowadays, it's more common to test for something called MTHFR. So MTHFR stands for methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. It's an enzyme that breaks down and metabolizes synthetic folic acid into its active form, folate, B9. And we need that. We need it for mood. We need it for neurotransmitters. We need it for detoxification. It's extremely important. But it's one part of the puzzle. So when I work with clients, we look at the entire methylation pathway, and that's going to be really helpful. There's about 10 other genes that support methylation. So even if you don't have MTHFR and you only tested that, you may have FOLR1 and 2, you might have MTHFD1. And so it's important to kind of look at that whole thing. But the good news is we can optimize those pathways. We can really help support them, but they're a huge contributor. One of the most common, or, comes with the best way would be like the highest need for support is how I would say the best way to describe that is MTHFR C677T. It's largely linked to depression symptoms. I saw that when I worked in psychiatry. We tested everybody with that, and most of them need activated folate and methyl B complex to support that. And it can be a game changer. It can be so helpful in driving down those inflammatory levels, and looking at things like homocysteine and glutathione, all a part of that methylation pathway, acetylcysteine, methionine, and making sure that all of those things are kind of working well together is really important. Some other genes that I see associated, one's called COMT, catechomethyltransferase. It's an enzyme that breaks down a few things, catecholamines, number one. So, like adrenaline, and it also breaks down estrogen. So oftentimes we see people who are sluggish in that pathway, and we can see where, if we get this kind of like spike of adrenaline or this estrogen dominant state, that we're prone to those physical symptoms of my heart's racing and I feel clammy all the time. And, my mind is worrying, and it seems like someone cut me off in traffic and I can't calm down for 8 hours. they may not be very good at burning through that adrenaline, or they might develop estrogen dominant symptoms, which, as you know, estrogen's like a little bit of a lioness molecule. So if she's not balanced out and going down the right pathway and in relation to her progesterone, then she can be a little raw and cause a little bit of that heightened fight or flight too. So that's another pathway that we look at and support. And really things like exercise and movement and supporting estrogen pathways are profoundly helpful. So much so people can function normally and, they don't have panic attacks anymore. We go through and address all of these different things. And just because they have that doesn't mean that they're never going to be free of panic attacks. So it's just one piece of the puzzle that kind of gives us a good picture of kind of why and what they've been going through.
Yeah. I love it because B vitamins are water soluble. So that's something you can actually just take. You can just start taking a methylated B complex and people can notice, like you're saying, this huge difference in the way you feel from something that's very simple and pretty easy. I would say, like, every supplement has consequences, but because of the water solubility, it's something that you could kind of feel comfortable just going and buying and trying out. But you do, like you were mentioning, you want to make sure it's methylated B, because if you have that variant and you're taking folic acid, you're not going to absorb it as well.
Yeah. And that's still very commonly used and prescribed in prenatals and stuff, even at your conventional doc. So you have to be careful. You really need to pay attention to that, and make sure that it is activated. And because 45% of the population has that, maybe more. So definitely something we want to be aware of. And the last ones for testing, I do a lot of genetics, but I think the autophage genes are super helpful for inflammation that we see. We know that if we're sluggish at autophage, then we can tend to get a lot of oxidative stress, and we have a higher need for antioxidant levels. And so looking at that pathway is really helpful for us too, to just kind of help support apoptosis and really kind of help support cell recycling, which there's a lot of research now for that for brain health. And that's really, really key process there as well.
And that's all cellular metabolism. So people they're like, apoptosis, what is that? So yes, that is cellular metabolism, making sure that your cells are creating the energy we need for cell health. And that affects everything because well, that's wonderful. Yeah. So when you're like, someone who has, let's use anxiety, for example, because that's, so common. So many of us have anxiety. And you're going to go in and most likely you're going to be given an SSRI. That's sort of the standard treatment. Even, now, there's research that even menopause, they're giving SSRIs for hormones. They're giving them for gut health. You can go to your gastroenterologist now and they can say, here, take an SSRI. So they're kind of just being the blanket of all of these symptoms that are non-specific, like the low energy or the mood or all these, where that's really not the root cause and causing other problems along the way, sometimes even intestinal permeability. So would you want to talk a little bit to that?
Yeah, I think the biggest consideration is I've been on both sides of this now. And so, yeah, I've written that med 100 billion times. I've seen that. If it was working, then things would be better. It's like we're prescribing it more, but things aren't improving. So even like all the research, all the stuff, sometimes it's common sense. It's like depression rates are at an all-time high, anxiety rates are at an all-time high, IBS rates are at and yet we're prescribing SSRIs galore. So it's pretty easy to understand that's not helping, that's not the answer. So the biggest umbrella thing I think to take away from this is that most mental health symptoms are brain inflammation. They're inflammatory. And SSRIs do not do anything for inflammation. As you mentioned, specifically, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors actually can cause leaky gut. They can worsen degradation of the gut lining. So we are seeing that it's not helping. And now we understand that it can actually worsen some of these diagnoses long-term. So really understanding that this is an inflammatory cascade, that symptoms of anxiety and mood are largely inflammatory based. And so it can be gut inflammation, liver inflammation, brain inflammation. Our guts and brain are directly connected through the vagus nerve. So yes, things like lipopolysaccharides and endotoxins from our gut can absolutely directly impact our brain and lead to brain inflammation. And we do see anxiety and depression at that height, even things like OCD So we know that there is a direct connection here, and SSRIs do not address that at all. So that's where the disconnect is. And you're totally right. We see, oh, you have IBS, so let's try this SSRI. And oh, you have anxiety, so let's try that, or menopause or insomnia, so on and so forth. And what's a little aggravating to me is it's women. It's women.
I know, you're right. Women. That's true.
There's two things that we get as women. We get birth control pills and we get SSRIs for everything. Everything. You got stress, you're on one of those. You got mood issues, you're put on one of those, or both. You got gut issues, you're put on one of those, or both. I mean, you got acne.
Yeah, we've had said at the same time.
It's everything. And it's just kind of like, again, it's when you take a step back and you're looking at it, it's sort of like the Matrix. You're like, what? Like, this is not helping. And why are those our options? Why am I going in and having these chronic symptoms and being told that it's just IBS, or it's just stress, or you're just a mom, and these are your two options? And we see this every single day, and I know you do too, but it's, we wouldn't be so busy if that was working,
Yes, you're right.
and I just feel like I am excited for the future, though, because I do feel like when I was going through this was way harder to find this type of information. And yes, not everything on TikTok is good or helpful or accurate, and social media too, but there is awareness coming to this. I'm getting 18-year-old girls who are like, hey, like, I don't want to be on birth control pills. I saw on TikTok that it's not actually the root cause. I don't know what is, but like, that's what they told me to take, and I don't want to take that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I just want to cry because I wish that I had seen that when I was 14, So even though it sounds all doom and gloom, guys, I do want to say, like, there's beginning to be a lot of awareness around this. And a lot of women are starting to advocate for themselves and ask questions and understand that it is a service for them and about them, and that they get to decide. And they get to ask questions. They're supposed to ask questions and not feel like a burden if you're asking questions. So anyways, that's a whole nother.
Yeah. Well, and we have our intuition. Like, we know when we don't feel well. And you hear the stories every day of like, well, I won't, like, you're even having people ask, hey, can you run this level for me? I feel like I have this. And they're like, no, you don't, I won't run that. And like, well, it's actually your body. You're empowered to be able to look into things, look into getting nutrients checked, look into getting your hormones checked, getting your inflammation, your gut, all these things that you're just not, it's so controlled, you're not able to get the answer. So the awareness is wonderful. And the fact that we're all empowered now to be able to take control and really trust your instinct. If you're exhausted, if you're anxious, if you have mood swings, if you're depressed, if you have any of these symptoms, something is going on. Like, our body is trying to tell us that something is going on. So we need to listen.
Yeah, absolutely. I love talking about that. So yeah, to bring it kind of back, we know that, chronic disease states are largely due to inflammation. And so now we're just kind of, a lot of people don't understand that means mood symptoms too. And that's kind of where we're saying, like, it's not just inflammation's at the root of chronic disease. We see that inflammation and brain inflammation is at the root of mental health. So that's kind of my biggest statement for that. And so depending on the severity, right? If someone just has transient inflammation because they got bad gut health versus someone who had a traumatic brain injury, how I address them is very different, and they're way more complex. But oftentimes, some of the most helpful things is, number one, nutrition and lifestyle. So exercise is still one of the most potent things for brain inflammation, and is so helpful. And I love weight training. So I think weight training specifically is one of the most powerful things we can do for mood, but actually it brings down brain inflammation. So that's really key. Polyphenols, good microbiome diversity, and good gut health, reestablishing that microbiome. Again, like we mentioned, just as if your microbiome's imbalanced, it's connected to the vagus nerve, to the brain, that can cause brain issues. If your microbiome's balanced and healthy and diverse and thriving, that translates through the vagus nerve to the brain as well. So gut health is a huge component to neuroinflammation or lack thereof, improvement of that. And that's where we see things like nutrition play a big role. Things like gluten and people with gluten intolerances and things like that. Gluten, the amino acid sequence in our cerebellum, Purkinje cells, mimics that. So we actually can get an autoimmune type reaction in the brain from people who are specifically sensitive to gluten. That's why there's something people have heard of called gluten ataxia, where you can actually have these episodes because our body, through something called molecular mimicry, sees those gluten antibodies and attacks our brain. And so, we have to address that hypervigilance of our immune system and really drive down that inflammation through nutrition. So consuming anti-inflammatory whole foods and avoiding processed foods. And I know that avoiding gluten is difficult for a lot of people, but it's one of the most important things, especially if you're having mood symptoms or brain inflammation. It's a game changer for people. And sometimes that extends into some other things, but that's just one of the most common we see with that brain inflammation and molecular mimicry. So, avoiding that type of thing. I made nutritional changes and felt better in 2 weeks. And I was very sensitive to gluten and dairy. And so just avoiding those was a game changer for me.
And that's always a great place. Like that's always what I'm trying to share in the show is there's things that you can just do every day. So sometimes we see this person with like you're saying, the chronic neuroinflammation that is more complex, but try a few weeks or a month of gluten and dairy and like eliminate them and just see if you without a B complex. And you may be one of those people that in 2 weeks feel so much better. And you're like, wow, I can't believe I never did this before. So there's all sorts of steps along the continuum that can be so helpful.
Yep. So helpful. I would say those are two of the biggest ones. And, really watching stress and lifestyle stress reduction and exercise, like I mentioned, exercise, and it's still going to be similar. If you listen to Meg's podcast, it's going to be the same, very similar things that most people will talk about. It really is. It's eating and consuming whole foods and avoiding those inflammatory triggers and really listening to your body and slowing down and resetting your nervous system and breathing and, getting good sleep and all of those things. Now, of course, we geek out and I do testing and we correct nutrient levels and genetics and gut health and all of those things. But like she mentioned, there are some simple things that you can do that can make a world of a difference, or at least start your pathway, really start your journey literally tomorrow by making a few of those things a priority. And then really some other specifics, like I mentioned, specific polyphenols and NAC and things like lion's mane and specific mushrooms, bacopa, like a lot of those things can really help support the brain. But at the end of the day, nutraceuticals are amazing, but they won't just get rid of all of your inflammation and correct some of these underlying dynamics. They're amazing. Resveratrol, love for brain inflammation. Curcumin and resveratrol are two of my go-tos, and they support the gut as well. And they can be a game changer, but it truly is going to be nutritional and lifestyle driven. Exercise, those are going to be really, really key to driving down this inflammation and building resiliency for your body and your brain.
Well, thank you. This is all so helpful. I know it's a lot of us, there's so many things actually that are going on in the world that cause the anxiety that are put, and we could spend a whole episode talking about stress. I know people get tired of me saying like about get back, and that's parasympathetic nervous system because there's so much going on. But we also have to be able to we can't control the outside, but we can control our body's response. So you're doing all of these things to control your responses that are helping you decrease your inflammation and therefore improve all of these symptoms. So thank you so much for all the information you provided. And can you tell guests where they can find you?
Yeah, so I hang out mostly on Instagram. It's just at Shay Leonard. Also on TikTok at Shay and Leonard. And then my website is just shayleonard.com.
Well, thank you so much, Shay. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Meg. Take care.
Thank you.